Hi, everyone. So our next speaker is Yann Joly from McGill University. Yann's going to talk about incentivizing open data sharing. What is in it for me? So thank you very much for your talk, Yann.
Sure. It's my pleasure to be here. I would like to first start by thanking the host of the conference, GANSI Ontario, and the Data Sciences Institute at the University of Toronto for the invitation. It's very nice to be here, and it is a very high quality conference, so it's great to have this opportunity. So my talk this afternoon, as was mentioned by Rohan, is incentivizing open data sharing. What's in it for me? The idea is that I think that a lot of us, especially, and when I say us, I mean people that have an interest in open data sciences and in big data, we sort of take this open data sharing for granted, as in, of course, this is what needs to be done, and this is the right way to proceed. And sometimes we don't really understand why people aren't doing it. But the reality of it is that people work by incentive. I mean, of course, altruism probably helped to some extent, but the reality of it is that incentives are very important in order to have a large scale adoption of open data sharing. And I think that this question of incentive has been flying on the radar for quite a long time. Of course, you know, we are working on this, and I'll speak to some example of that, but I think much more can and should be done if we want data to be much more open in the research context. And rather than you know, forcing you to sort of agree with me, I'll try to convince you by using a case study approach of this. And yeah, then once I've convinced you, I hope through the case study, we'll talk a bit about the various incentives, and I'll be opening the discussion to hear from you and what you think are good options, etc., for future development. So the case study I will use for today is Cancro virus-seq. Some of you might be familiar with this consortium. It's a consortium that was tasked with sequencing the virus of the COVID-19 virus sequences from people that were sick with COVID, and of sharing the virus then through international repositories. So that will be the first part, that case study. Then we'll go on and identify the key incentives, and then we'll go on and discuss what can we do in the future to improve the situation. So talking about Cancro virus-seq, so what is this beast? It's a consortium that was initially put together by Genome Canada. It's a consortium of Canadian federal, provincial, and regional public health authorities and their healthcare partners, academia, industry, hospital, research institute, CGen, and the regional genome centers. And it was created in April 2020, so about 2-3 months after the pandemic started, really. And you can see here a little bit how our public health system works in times of pandemic. So we have what we call the CPLHN, and you can see it on this little diagram, which is really a central lab that's there to harmonize the action of the different provincial public health labs. And that was really the nucleus of this Cancro virus-seq. There was another partner to Cancro, which was called OSEQ, and OSEQ was basically responsible for sequencing the virus of the human host, or rather the human host of the virus, sorry. So you had the sequence of the patient that was done by OSEQ, and the sequence of the virus that was done through virus-seq. OSEQ was mostly operated by academic researchers, while VirusSeq was mostly active through public health agencies. And you can see the amount of money that was put into this, not marginal, and it was then after additional amount were injected into this. The initial objective was 10,000 host or patient genomes and 150,000 viral genome sequence that would be done and eventually shared. I was involved in this because early on, they realized that, yes, data sharing is going to be something that we need to be aware of. And I think that as things progressed, they realized that not only was it something they needed to be aware of, but that this was going to be a big deal for this consortium. And so my involvement in the project just kept growing. I was on several committees deep in the trench, and I also acted as chair of their data sharing committee, which was quite a big amount of work. And I'll talk to that a little bit. And yes, data sharing, as I mentioned, was identified early on in the project as a priority. So how did things go for VirusSeq? Well, not too well. If you can look at this graph of the first year. So this graph, it's a paper that was published in Nature Biotechnology. Basically, what it looks at is how long did it take for various countries that deposited their data in the open database GSAID. So basically, the virus sequence data that they have, and a minimal amount of non-identifying metadata with it. Things like male or female, age, in groups, things like that. And so this measure was done in May 2021. So that's about a little bit over a year after the consortium was created. So we ranked 48 out of 54 countries. And when you look at some of these countries, and you can see the red arrow is where Canada is at the end of the pack. Yeah, it was concerning, to say the least. It took us on average 88 days from collection to submission. So from the time we had basically taken a sample from a COVID patient to the time where we were ready to deposit this in the GSAID repository, which is one of the most popular international repository for this type of data. It's something that's between completely open and controlled access. You basically, in order to use the data in the repository, have to sign an access agreement. It's a little bit stringent in that it restricts a little bit what you can do with the data. You can't, for example, try to mix and match this data with other data sets that you have collected. And you also have specific requirement regarding attributions. Like I said, 88 days for over 44,000 genome. If you look at the United Kingdom, for example, they're closer to something between 15 and 25 days. So I'd say 20 days on average, probably, for the United Kingdom that were first by comparison. Okay, now we're going to look at this. Well, let's try first of all to figure out why this happened. Data sharing for research was not viewed as a priority by Canadian Public Health Lab. They felt like, you know, our primary job is to really track down the progression of the virus, see the evolution of the viral sequence, do epidemiology, these sorts of things. But sharing for research, even though they had been told when they received the money that this was something they would need to do, they viewed it as something we need to do, but it's quite bothersome and it's definitely not our first priority. I think that's the best way to describe it. There was also, historically in Canada, we've always suffered from the lack of a united governance framework for data sharing across the provinces It's true, because first of all, our policies are provincial in nature and institutional in nature. But it's also true because the way public health work, it's really provincial. And yes, there is CPLHN, that central hub that I showed before, and it helps harmonize a little bit the practice, but it's still viewed as we're doing things in our own lab and collaborating with others sort of on a need-to-know basis. And mostly for health and epidemiology, but much less for research, where we are still in a bit of a competitive environment. So many justifications were advanced to explain the poor performance in the first year. None of them were really convincing. So we were told things like, well, we can't really release this because there's a question of patient privacy, and well, viral sequence don't really have privacy rights, to my knowledge. And we're not talking about the human patient. We're talking about information that is non-identifying. We were also told at the beginning, well, there might be ownership rights, there might be secrecy concerns, all kinds of things. So that's why I said, lots of justification, but really nothing completely convincing. Let's see how the story progressed. So this is another graph that was taken this time in January of, not 2022, January, of course, 2021, sorry for what's written there. And basically what happened is that we see that the lag, which by the way peaked to around 90 days, that was 90 days was, let me see if I've taken it down. It was, I believe, let me see, August. Yeah, 90 days was in August. And then it went down all of a sudden, close to Christmas 2021, nice Christmas gift. We are now managing to do things in around 54 days, compared to, as you can see on the preceding slide, where we were closer to 80 days. So that's already quite a big progress. And you can also see that in the number. So this time, oh, that's what I meant. Yes, as of January 2022, and that is accurate, we have now 251,000 viral sequence available on GSAID. And I can tell you also that the lag now in January, February 2022, it now takes us a little bit over 20 days to do this work. So we've improved tremendously. And now, I keep thinking in my head, okay, why was it not working in the first year when there was, the big emergency? Because in time of pandemic, you want to act fast. I mean, it's great to hear and to know that now we've got it, but why didn't we get it in the first year? Here's some of the things that have changed since the first year, and that might explain this change in performance. So first of all, the Public Health Lab through CPLHN and the National Microbiology Laboratory applied for additional funding for capacity building, basically improve the capacity to do genomic sequencing, etc. And they got the funds and they distributed this additional funding to provincial labs. Furthermore, Genome Canada also offered additional funding to labs that basically needed more in order to do more genome sequence, etc. Then there was a lot of added public and political pressure, especially in the first year when we saw that things were not happening the way they should have been happening. What I mean to say is that academic published article in the media to complain about poor data sharing. I also mean to say that there were discussion at governmental tables involving all kinds of specialized group about what can we do to improve the outlook, presentations, etc. on the situation. So this puts pressure on groups that are not sharing, because all of a sudden they're sort of at the center of discussions that they'd rather not see other people have about them. So that kind of pressure was there and was put on them, on public health centers. There was also a portal that was developed, a Canadian portal. We said, well, we'll do a Canadian portal to make it even more easy to deposit data, because there was some complaint in the community about GSAID being a little bit too difficult for users, and we wanted something more friendly, and we thought maybe we can put some additional component in the portal that's going to make it facilitate data analysis, things like that. That's going to be even helpful for public health center, that they might want to use some of these new features to see their data. So that was developed. In addition to that, there were information briefs, practical and technical advice that was basically given to the center. So basically, when they would raise a question about, well, we're not sharing because, you know, we think privacy is a concern. So we would say, okay, well, let's look into it. And then we would write down a memo or an advice to the privacy officer of the province that had raised this question. So basically, these are all the things that have changed, and that may explain, you know, the big improvement in the performance of CPLHN and depositing this data in GSAID. And as you can see, all of these things are what I would consider incentive. You know, why would you want to share data? Because somebody is offering to boost your capacity if you do it. Why would you want to share data? Because people are putting a lot of pressure on you and you're in the spotlight because you're not doing it. Why would you want to share data? Because some biotechnology expert are proposing to develop a portal for you to make it more easy to deposit and to make it more interesting to analyze your data. Why are you depositing? Because people are ready to help you handle all the ethical and governance issues that are associated with you not depositing. So we can see the importance of incentives and all of this. So now let's move on. I hope I've convinced you with this case about the importance of incentive in this game. So, you know, what do we mean by incentive? I like to start by common definition. So you see that both the Merriam-Webster and Cambridge are coming to about the same thing, which is really, there's something to encourage someone to do something, basically. And we can think of traditional incentive that tend to work. We can think of financial incentive. We can think of peer recognition. And I'm thinking, you know, within a more or less academic context, which is really what concerns us. We can think about intellectual property rights. We can think about promotion, self-promotion. I mean, you know, it is good if you publish a lot, if you share a lot your data, you get your name across, peer recognition. And we can think about sanction, right? If your university tells you you have to share, or if your journals tell you you have to share your data, or else we're not publishing your paper, it might work. So I would say some of these traditional incentives are well aligned with the reality of open science, but not all of them. So basically, I think that we cannot rely, and that's really my thesis here, is we cannot only rely on traditional incentive to make open science work. And as I mentioned, I do think altruism can be a factor for some people. I just don't think we can rely on it to make open science work. I think we need to do more. So here's a list I've made myself of what do I think are some of the key incentives that could work. And this is a work in progress. So please do let me know what you think of that list. And if you have suggestions of things that we could add to it, that would also work well. So the first line is mostly what I like to think of social incentive. Really, you know, acknowledgements. Well, they're social and they're professional. So acknowledgement, attribution, and authorship. So basically, it's about people recognizing, you know, your intellectual contribution to science, you know, and through different means. And I'll explain about the colors in a minute. You know, peer recognition is a bit similar. It's, you know, the fact that in some community, And again, it's really social norms are now recognizing the fact that somebody shares, and that, for example, in bioinformatics, these norms are really deeply ingrained. If you share your source code, if you develop openly, if you encourage data sharing, you would be more recognized in the community. Then there's, of course, the question of funding and capacity building, which I think is really key in incentivizing scientists to share data. It costs money. So when a funder requires you to share data, I'm always intrigued about, okay, they want a data sharing plan. They want us to share. Do they provide financial incentive to do this properly? Then there is, of course, the question of expertise. It's very complex to share your data. Sometimes you need to have legal, ethical, unless you really are a part of a larger consortium that can help you with these. You need legal, ethical, and technical skill set that you may not have if you're a small researcher, and that might be expensive to buy. So if somebody can provide this, that's a nice incentive too. We talked about pressure, and it can come from many different avenues to share. That's also an incentive. Collaboration requirements. So sometimes you will see this in databases. We're sharing our data with you, but we want you to collaborate. If you intend to use this data, you're required to collaborate with us. So that might be an incentive. I'm doing this, I'm sharing my data because I want people to collaborate with me. I also have seen in other database requirement that users using the data must return enriched data set to the database. That's also interesting. So I'm hoping that people will actually make my data better and return it to me so that I can then include it in the database, this bona fide data set. And finally, there's been a lot of other proposition embargo. So people can access the data, but they won't be able to use it right away. Data retention, okay. I have the right to 6 months or 12 months before I publish the data or make it available, and intellectual property. Now on to the color code. The color code is simply my way to say some of these incentives, the ones that are in green, I give them green light. I mean, you can use them anywhere, anytime. And I think these are good incentives and that work. The orange ones are to use with caution, because these are the type of incentive that can sometimes backfire and do more damage to open science than they will contribute to incentivizing a data provider. So for example, authorship, sometimes some database or a data producer will require you to basically make them co-author of a publication if you use your data. So there's been some complaint about that this doesn't actually meet the norm of the International Committee of Medical Journal Editor. So first of all, from an ethical standpoint and from a journal ethics standpoint, not sure it meets the requirement for authorship to procure data. We can discuss this, but it's also something that might dissuade people from using the data. Pressure may work up to a point. I think that you can put as much pressure as you can, but if there's no carrot at the end, you won't get much happening. You need to also fund, you need to help boost the capacity, and there needs to be some sort of recognition that goes along with the pressure for it to work. Collaboration requirement, I'd say the same as authorship. Sometimes this is going to dissuade people from working with you. And similar with the requirement to return enriched data set, although that's probably the one I like the most and the ones in orange. Those in red really annoy me because they're really, basically just allows people to keep things secret and private longer. Embargo is probably the most acceptable of the three. Data retention, I don't like unless it's really minimal and justified. Intellectual property, really, if you're talking about raw data, if you're not talking about an invention, if there hasn't been, if you haven't brought an intellectual addition This is what intellectual property is made to reward. It's made to reward creation of the mind. If you've only produced data and you haven't added anything to this data, I don't think intellectual property is the right reward. Plus, it kills open science. So I would definitely say no to that. Now, let's talk about the next step. We have our incentives. We have our list of incentives. What's the next step? The next step is, how can we make sure we all harmonize those incentives so that one big problem I see right now in the community is that there's different ways of rewarding through attribution, for example. So if I have a database, unless I put forward my own requirements, I'm not really sure how people are going to credit me if they use my data, because we're not following common standard. We're just multiplying standards of ways that people will actually reward me. And it's also similar with funders, if you think about it. Some funders will actually support financially the creation of database and data sharing. Others will do very little for that. So we need to find a way to make this more predictable and more harmonized. So like I said, the benefit of international harmonizations are that this is going to make this more predictable, this business, more rapid. I talked about the fact that we were too slow with VirusSeq. Well, if everything is standardized before the crisis, then we can implement rapidly and share rapidly because the rules are all in place and they're predictable. And it's more equitable to everyone, because then we can also start worrying about those that may have less to gain from data sharing and might feel it's too expensive for us, because then we're more transparent as a business and we can see where the problems are and work on maybe adjusting our norms to be more equitable. There are organizations that are that are operating in despair of international harmonization. In my field, in genomics, we can talk about the Global Alliance for Genomics and Health, and PHAGE, which is, so basically GA4GH is really about harmonization of human genomic, for human genomic research and health data sharing. So what kind of tools can we develop to share and to make this data sharing of human genomic data and health metadata to make it more transparent, more effective, more reliable? Sorry. And PHAGE does a similar thing for non-human pathogen data sets. So these two organizations have developed quite a lot of tools, but to my knowledge, there is not common standard, and I've looked, there's very little that have been developed in terms of common incentive at the international level, common standard of incentives. There's the work that I've seen is really on how do you properly refer to bioresources or research resources. So how do you give credit to a database? And so I really recommend for those of you that are interested in this, you can look, these are some of the first international tools to do that. So you have the Bioresource Research Impact Factor, or BRIF, the Research Resource Identifier, also called RIT, and the citation of bioresources in journal articles called COBRA. These are all fairly new tools that we've seen developed in the last 5 years, I would say. And again, they are international, but how widespread is their use is something that there's very few metrics on at this point in time. But I think there needs to be more of that. And I think we need to think of other incentives that need to be set standardized beyond citation of database, which is a good place to start, but we need more of this. Now I'm almost at the end of my presentation. So what are the next steps in my own perspective? Well, I think that, you know, for VirusSeq, what's the next step would be really to agree on a pan-Canadian standard to acknowledge contribution of Canadian viral sequence data producers to open access repository. it's a little bit incredible to think that it's so complicated to just agree on one Canadian standard. But I can tell you it's been quite an adventure to try and propose a common standard to our different partners and have them agree to it. The other problem is even when you have this common standard, then what you do when you also want to put your data in GSAID, which as a database, as a standard itself on how people using GSAID data should acknowledge their sources. So you end up with basically a superposition of various acknowledgement standard and people not knowing which standard to use. In parallel, I think we need to consolidate, and that's exactly what I mean here, existing attribution standard and develop new ones where needed only. Meaning, let's not multiply our standard. Let's see what's out there in the community and try to consolidate and to integrate them to make them more robust and to start using similar standard rather than, like I said, continuing this multiplication of standard, which really complexify and make negotiation much longer than they ought to be before we can access data. Also, and that speaks to the other incentive I've mentioned earlier in my presentation, I think it'd be important to see people agree, at least as a first point, on a list of key incentive with harmonized definition. So what do we mean by capacity building, for example? What's an acceptable contribution to capacity building if you're going to use this as an incentive? What's acceptable pressure to put on a stakeholder, etc.? And go, no-go indicator, meaning no, this might be an incentive, but it's off the list for an ethical reason, etc. And try to see if this list could be endorsed by key international organization and international organization for medical journals, so that then we can have some traction and start working with a common system of incentives to make this work in the medical data sharing world. And on that, I want to thank everyone for listening in, and if there's any question, be happy to address them.
Thank you very much, Yann. That was incredible. Thank you very much for sharing your experiences. Does anyone have any questions? I feel like some of the biogenetic people might. Oh, Robert?
Hi, Yann. Thanks for the very interesting presentation. It's always good to see Canadians working in this space. I was wondering if you could comment on the tri-agency data management policy that's going to be put into effect, where people funded by one of the tri-agencies are going to have to put their data in a repository. I don't know the exact details on it, but you've gone into the details of how difficult this data sharing can be just in this one case where there's a lot of energy and money put into it. Do you foresee the tri-agency's new policy working effectively, or do you see some roadblocks that will happen towards more data sharing, or at least storing data in relation to that policy?
It's a good question. I think I see this relatively positively. I've seen the policy. I mean, it doesn't require too much. It's fairly open at the moment in terms of, it asks for a few really broad sort of objective for institution and repositories, such as you must have somebody that's responsible, of privacy implication if that happens. You must have a policy that's in place for that point in time. In some general aspect that you must address through these policies. I don't see it as super stringent. I think that also depending on which type of research you're doing, it's been a few years already that things were, starting to be discussed. So it's not something that's going to come as a complete surprise also for stakeholders. So that's why I'm saying I see this as a positive thing. Again, I do think that there will have to be considerations of funding if agencies like CIHR or Genome Canada for genetic research are expecting these things to happen. They really have to be aware of the costs that come with that.
Great, thanks.
Sure.
Are there any other questions? Devin?
There it is. Hi, great presentation. That was really nice to see. I'm one of the people who's working on this data and was working on it at the start and was probably mad at you personally at the start of this. So it was great to see. Yeah, that was really nice to see. You listed all of them as incentives. Are some of them just removing roadblocks instead, or removing obstacles? Like, for instance, the data sharing policies or the privacy concerns are more about just making sure they're not stopped from doing it rather than incentivizing them from doing it.
Yes, it's fair enough. You are removing roadblock, but at the same time, you know, what I'm thinking about is a context where, for example, let's talk about virus seek. You have this context where you know, you're being told by an agency you need to share data. So you know that you have to share data. But then, you know, it becomes easy to invoke privacy hurdles or all sorts of reasons because, you know, are you going to pay really to have some advice on privacy? Maybe you have a privacy counsel at your institution, but maybe he's been there for 30 years, 40 years. He's not really into the new data sharing norms, and you know, it would require a lot of him to work on that. It's going to take a few weeks. Sometimes we get these answers, you know, it's going to take 4 or 5 weeks or a month. We'll get back to you. There's a pandemic going on. Please, you know, can we short circuit this process? So yes, you're right. You know, it is removing roadblock, but it's also making life easier on scientists by telling them you don't have to worry about that yourself. We'll help you out there. A bit of both.
Yeah, thanks for that. And just to clarify, I was joking. I'm not actually holding it against you or anyone in particular.
It's okay. As I said, I was a bit in the trench, so, you know, I expected a little bit of each for that.
Thank you.
Sure, pleasure.
Are there any other questions? Ben, Michael, just trying to see other genetics people. Right, well, that takes us to 5. So we might just say thank you very much, Yann. Really appreciate your work.
It was my pleasure, Ron. Thank you for having me.
Thank you very much. And we'll resume again at 8:30 tomorrow. So hopefully folks can make it again. Otherwise, thanks very much. Have a nice day.